This is not a plateau. He was going through the motions. He was only acting on the world, not being in charge of it. He described the feeling like he's watching himself in a movie. This was my client 2.5 years after aphasia. He had returned to work, was driving, doing the things that he loved, but something was missing. Your world feels small and you don't know what to do next. If you are feeling this hole, I want you to pause for a moment. Do you have words for what that hole feels like? How would you explain it to someone else? Have you tried to explain it to someone else? My client came to realize that part of this hole he described was his isolation. He was pushing away his wife, avoiding friends because he felt shame for having had the stroke in the prime of his very healthy, successful, and fulfilling life. And he felt that it was all gone because he had some difficulty getting his thoughts and his words out. The shame he felt came from his loss of identity and grief. He worked hard and stayed busy so he could avoid the grief. Why? Because it's uncomfortable, because it's painful even. When grief after a major medical event is avoided or unaddressed, recovery can feel like it comes to a halt, even though the person's capacity to move forward is still there. So what is holding people back? Here's what I see. A person finishes rehab. They're told they've made good gains, and then essentially they're told, okay, now go live. Sometimes clinicians don't know what else to do. Sometimes physicians or therapists unintentionally close the door by calling it a plateau. But here's what they often miss. The foundation was never fully built. I mean the emotional foundation. Here's where progress can stall. I work primarily in the chronic aphasia space. Often I meet people years after rehab. We start working on speech. We make real progress, and then it stalls again. When we work on skills in speech therapy, we need them to transfer out of the clinic and into the real world. We call this generalization, which means, can you use these skills in real life? And when that doesn't happen, it's usually not because someone can't do it. It's because they don't feel safe enough to try. Inside therapy, things feel contained. But outside therapy, everything feels exposed. When communication skills don't generalize, it's rarely a language problem. It's often a safety problem. The real roadblock, grief and identity. If you haven't had space to process how your life changed after a stroke and aphasia, it's hard to move forward. If you don't feel confident, if you don't feel like yourself, if you're still carrying unspoken grief, using your communication in real world feels risky. As grief coach Megan Young shared in our earlier conversations, grief doesn't disappear just because life keeps going. Why this affects survivors and care partners differently. Aphasia doesn't just affect speech. It affects how people process information and emotions. Many survivors are thinking in more concrete, present-focused ways. They may feel something's missing, but they may not have the words to explain it. Care partners often see the big picture of recovery. They understand the repercussions of aphasia. They understand what's changed and what's at stake. Both people are rebuilding, but they're not rebuilding in the same way and definitely not at the same pace. When this difference is understood, both sides, it's so important for survivors and care partners to understand that there is a difference. because when it's not acknowledged, both sides feel stuck and unseen. I look at aphasia recovery as a 3-phase process. This is a cornerstone of how I conceptualize rebuilding life after aphasia. So I see recovery as 3 expanding circles. The phase 1 is the smallest circle. Think of it as the foundation phase. In speech therapy and in general recovery, we look at communication and connection in the home. Your world was big and full before you had the stroke. And that big world shrunk down to the size of a pinhead. And what you have to do is rebuild that circle. And it starts with the smallest, which is the foundation circle. In this foundation phase, we have to talk about safety, emotional regulation, identity, daily communication. So these are overarching concepts of recovery. It's not just about speech therapy, although that is a huge part of it. Helping people get their thoughts, feelings, words pulled together and expressed. Being willing to open up the conversation to think about, what do I want to do now? How do I want to rebuild my life? If grief isn't addressed or at least brought up, where the seed is planted in this first stage of recovery, everything else gets harder and recovery can stall. In phase 2 of recovery, I think of this as the connection phase. Think of this as a middle-sized circle. This is where generalization of speech and communication and connection skills starts really playing a role. Think of this as anything outside of your home. This is ordering at a restaurant. This is going to the bank and getting your transactions done with the teller. This is about making phone calls to professionals or hiring a handyman, whatever the situation may be. It could be going to gatherings with friends and family that you had been avoiding up into this phase. This phase of recovery also requires some confidence, courage, not just language skills. In phase 3 of recovery, I think of this as the living phase. This is the active participation in life. An example of this is traveling with agency. What does this mean? When you travel early in your recovery, you are passive. You are along for the ride. Somebody else has planned it. Maybe you gave an opinion about it. Maybe you didn't, but you were literally along for the ride. But in phase 3 of living, you are actively participating. You are making your wants, needs, opinions known. You're initiating. You're communicating with others. You have a voice if you want to learn more about how this works. Why is grief the foundation and not a detour in recovery? Grief doesn't get resolved quickly, but when there's a framework, there's predictability. And when you have predictability, there's safety. I've watched people sit in grief for years. Not because they didn't want to move forward, it's because no one gave them a safe way to go about doing it. Safety comes before change. I started this episode talking about one of my former clients who was pushing away his wife. He felt that he had to be the man that he always was, strong, confident, but his aphasia didn't make him feel that way. And to protect himself emotionally, he pushed her away. What he was doing, he took small intentional steps to let his wife back in. He brought down those walls. He opened up the communication. He allowed himself to work through the grieving process. And that's when he realized that she was also grieving. She was grieving not being connected to her husband. She was grieving the change in their life circumstance. But once they started talking about it and put some safety frameworks in place, put some activities back into practice, like their gratitude bowl, it made all the difference. And then his recovery skyrocketed because he built confidence. He started applying the strategies we were doing in the clinic out into the real world, and he had success. This is episode 182. In episode 180, we talked about grief and identity from the perspective of the person who is living with aphasia. Episode 181 is from the perspective of the spouse care partner who is supporting that person. All three of these episodes are meant to be experienced together because they follow the real order of change. Additionally, we have a companion blog for each of the episodes. It goes deeper into the research and the meaning and the practicalities of what you can do at home. We will link to all of these resources in the show notes below. This episode is your bridge to rebuilding your life, to addressing the grief, the sorrow, the change in identity. There is a way forward. And if you're listening to this years after rehab has ended, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not late. Grief does not follow a timeline, and recovery doesn't expire. The moment you understand what's been missing is the moment rebuilding can begin. So what comes next? Check out the previous episodes and check out the blog posts. We are always open to continuing the conversation. Get in the comments, leave a reply in the blog area. We read every single one of them. The deeper work happens when we walk through this rebuilding process together with structure, safety, and support. Our programs exist to hold this work so you don't have to carry it alone or guess your way through it. We have a program for people living with aphasia, and we have a parallel program for care partners. Each follows a 9-step rebuilding roadmap designed intentionally, so there is no trial and error. What can this look like for you? And so our first step is to simply connect. Let's get on a connection call. The link is below in the show notes. The purpose of this connection call is to understand where you are, who you are, what you're carrying, and what rebuilding could look like for you. Rebuilding your life doesn't mean becoming who you were before aphasia. It means becoming yourself again with support, clarity, and a path forward. Rehab ends. Recovery doesn't. Rebuild communication, rebuild connection, rebuild life. This is Life Beyond Aphasia.